Hello and welcome. This is a tutorial for crown design in the new inLab software 22. Here you'll see, if you're an existing inLab user, you'll see that the options are all still the same. So this is your administration screen when you're in the inLab CAD software. Now you will notice that it is a black screen. That was actually done on purpose. They did lots of studies in the last few years as we of course utilize our computers a lot more, especially with digital dentistry. It was determined that a black screen was actually a little bit more protective of the eyes, right? Not to strain them as much. So the new layout of the screen is actually done on purpose to ensure that we don't strain our eyes as much on a day-to-day basis with digital dentistry. Now in the administration screen, it's where we're filling in our prescription. So we are seeing that the indications are here on the left-hand side. So we've got restorations, which of course have our typical crown and bridge, implant supported bars, abutments, veneers, etc., etc. Then you'll see we also have the model builder below that. So that's, of course, identifying all of our model options for printed models. And then when it comes to printed models, there's the ability to now design a model for something like bleaching trays, which is kind of neat. So there's two types of models you can design now. In the partial framework application, that's where you're designing the framework itself. It is exactly as it suggests, the partial framework itself. It's not where it's creating the socket for the teeth as well. Sometimes I've seen people use the denture module for that, but that's not what it is. And then we have the splint and tray option. So that used to be under one option, so it is still utilizing the splint application for both. However, now tray has its own icon, but this is to create either a splint or a tray. Then we'll see that we've got the denture module. Now denture module is significantly improved in 22. In 20, we were able to do complete over complete dentures. In software 22, we are now able to do complete over complete as well as complete over natural, so that makes a big difference. Then we've got the CEREC guide option. So the CEREC guide in version 20 and prior to that, it was always just CEREC guide 2s. Now we are able to do both CEREC guide 2s and CEREC guide 3s in the inLab software 22. So more videos to follow on that. And then the final tab is the Atlantis option, where of course we can design or we can send scans to Atlantis, our implant partner, for things like custom bases, so custom titanium abutments, or even superstructures and things like that as well. So really great things coming out of Atlantis. But for today, we're going to select crown and then identify on the odontogram the tooth in question. So when we do select our tooth, you'll see that we aren't able to move forward until we fill in the case details on the right-hand side. So the first step here is the option of how it's going to design. So the very first option that it defaults to is anatomic. So this means that the system will start from scratch when doing its design. So that's kind of most commonly what you're going to utilize. So it's basically going to look at its surroundings to determine morphology based on opposing and based on adjacent teeth and based on its knowledge of, what should that tooth in question look like, a molar versus an anterior or premolar, etc. So anatomic, we're going to keep that on it today for the demonstration purpose. But then we've got copy. So this would be if you took something like a pre-op scan or if the doctor took a pre-op scan to send to the laboratory. The idea is that you can copy what the patient had pre-existing. So where this can come in really handy, for example, let's say the crown has a partial rest prep on it, we can actually copy that morphology. So the copy and mirror, kind of like the name would suggest, this is really good for symmetry, right? So if you're doing something like an anterior tooth, let's say we're doing the 1-1, we can mirror image the 2-1, so keeping symmetries and things like that. And then one-to-one copy, it's a really great functionality for if you're doing, more complex bridges or implant supported bridges, that sort of thing. The idea is that you can duplicate kind of one-to-one an actual wax up like a try-in denture and things like that. So it's a really nice option. Now just below that is multi-layer. Not really going to need to necessarily utilize multi-layer for a single crown unless you wanted to split basically the substructure material from the veneering structure. So again, when it comes to something like a single unit, not necessarily required, but if you're doing something like a implant supported crown, the idea with multi-layers, you can split it by abutment versus the actual crown on top. So once we have identified how we're going to design, so we're going to keep it on anatomic in this case, we can then choose our machine. So you'll see that MCX5 and MCXL are still there, just like in software 20. You'll also see that the 5-axis 0.6 instrument is as well too. But you'll see the addition of prime mill and prime print. So prime print being Dentsply Sirona new printer. that will be coming to Canada soon, so stay tuned for that. And then the Prime Mill. So the Prime Mill has the connectivity to the inLab software officially as of version 22, which is fantastic. So here I'm going to select Densify Sirona, and then I'm going to use the new Spheric Multilayer Zirconia. So it automatically defaults to identifying the processing mode, milling versus grinding, and identifying what burr will be used on the intaglio to basically come up with the mill strategy. Now, if this is an intraoral scan that we've downloaded into the system, which in this case it is, you'll see that the scan step is grayed out, and that's because the scan step is already taken care of on the intraoral scanner side of things. If I'm a laboratory, either importing an STL or using the INEOS X5 tabletop scanner, the scan phase will of course be opened up at this point, and we will proceed with the scan. Now for this particular case, it is an intraoral scan, so we're going to move forward with either the next button on the bottom here or the model tab on the top sidewalk. Both get us to the next step. So once in the model phase, the very first step is the edit model option. So basically the edit model option allows you to do exactly as the name would suggest, to make edits to the model itself. So we've got the tools of the form tool, which allows us to add, smooth, or remove material from the actual model itself from the scan. Then we have the cut tool. So exactly as the name would suggest, we can trim and cut away anything extra in the scan that we don't need. And then the replace tool. So the replace tool is actually very handy if, let's say you wanted to, fill in any small holes or even do a virtual extraction. So then the next option here, check occlusion, really nothing that we have to do in this particular step, but really what we're doing is we're looking at the patient's buccal bite registration scan. Okay, so that would have been taken care of on the intraoral scanner side of things. The next step here, set model axis. What we're lining up here is basically the quadrants within the actual arches. So you can see quadrant 1, quadrant 2, 3, and then 4. And so we want to basically make sure that they're lined up correctly within the corresponding quadrants here, or if it was a full arch, of course, the full arch itself. And then if the full arch or the full quadrant was even scanned, we want to pay attention to things like the midline. So on the on the very far right-hand side, you can see the midline from kind of a bird's eye view, which also then translates on the left-hand side of the screen, the very top left box, that would be the midline from the facial aspect. So then on the lower left screen, that's basically the occlusal plane that we're looking at. So we use things like our right cursor to basically physically pick up and move the occlusal plane if we want to physically move our model up and down. And then the left cursor allows us to tilt like you just saw there. So we have the ability to kind of make adjustments to these as needed for the design, because this will help the software determine the best design strategy. So the next step here, set jaw line. Really the most important thing here is that we have the correct tooth identified. Okay, so on top of the actual tooth, you'll see the icon for the tooth. If you did see at this point the wrong tooth numbering, just go back to administration, likely just the wrong tooth was selected. But in this case, we've got the 1-7 selected perfectly, so that's good. And then the side that's not scanned, we can just leave the dots where they are. I usually put the center one there on the midline, so if it's not scanned, I just leave it kind of as is. And then we want to look at corners of the arch, kind of mesial of the 6, and then end of the arch with the final dot. So when you use your left cursor, when it turns green, you can basically move it should you need to. Okay, so that's essentially how you're able to move those as needed. So then when we move forward to the next step, the trim model stage, this is where when we've identified the correct tooth, the system will auto trim kind of around it for us. The idea is that we're looking at it more like a removable die. If we wanted to trim further to really isolate that tooth for when we're in the next step, which is drawing the margin, I can double click with my left cursor, single click, and then double click to finish. And it'll basically trim away that area. Now it doesn't trim it obviously for once we start designing. It really is for the purpose of marking our margin correctly and kind of having that tooth isolated. Now it's not required to do this. The system does automatically trim usually. You can reset it if you want to. Some people prefer to look at the entire arch, in which case you can use that reset option on the upper right hand side. So the next step here, draw margin. Essentially, exactly as the name would suggest, we're drawing our margin. Now, if the software has determined this already for us, or if this was marked on the intraoral scanner side of things, at this point in time, we can just make edits to it. So anywhere that we see fit, we can go ahead and make adjustments by double clicking on that existing line, single clicking to tag down the line, which helps you to curve your margin line, and then a double click to finish. Now, if you were starting from scratch, if there was a question mark from the software, it just means that it can't find the margin for you, and in which case you just need to double click to start and then basically wrap around the tooth with your margin line. So once you have your margin determined, the next step is the set insertion axis. It's basically how are we inserting this post-manufacturing. So some will use the arrow on the top of the actual crown prep itself. I typically actually like to physically move my model around to with my left and right cursor, of course, mainly my left to rotate it. And then I hit apply view direction. And it essentially does the same thing as moving the arrow. It just gives me a better visual, I find, for determining the best insertion path. So once that's complete, we can move on to the design step. The first step of the design phase will always be the parameters. It always wants to know what parameters do you need to utilize, basically per material maybe, right? It's always important to make sure that you're setting parameters based on manufacturer's recommendations. So what some people will do is they'll go up to that upper densify Sorona icon and they'll select parameters, and that's where they can set a whole bunch. And then once they're all preset, you're able to use that drop-down arrow at the top there to pick which one best suits that particular case. So the idea is, again, if you wanted to do it per material, maybe zirconia, as per, lithium disilicate, whatever it might be, you can set parameters accordingly. Now, the next two steps here are just morphology and positioning. They're technically optional when you're doing something like a single crown. However, I just want to review what basically these options offer you. So in the adjust morphology stage, at step 1, it does note that it's a posterior tooth for you, and it's using what's known as biogeneric. So biogeneric offers basically the really great functionality of kind of looking at its surroundings in the software to determine the best fit proposal. So what that means is, let's say it is a severe bruxer who's got very flat anatomy. The software is going to propose very flat anatomy to follow kind of what's existing in the patient's mouth. Now you can change it, of course, with biogeneric, which I'll show you in the edit element stage, to have more, cusp anatomy and pits and fissures, that sort of thing. But it'll default to looking at kind of what's in the patient's mouth existing to determine the best fit solution for the design. Now we do have a small tooth database if you did want to use something like a denture tooth. Very small options there. There's about 3 manufacturers. Again, that really, to me, only makes sense if you're designing a crown next to a partial. Otherwise, I find biogeneric really gives you the most control of the design, as well as the most options in terms of changing your aesthetic. So let's say it is a severe bruxer, but you wanted to, slowly kind of get all the teeth back to nice anatomy sort of thing as you're doing maybe more crowns on the patient, you can change it that way. So, it's a lot more flexible. Now with the change tooth option, I want to point out this is really key if you are doing something like a bridge, and let's say your Pontic, you don't have space for a molar, but it is technically a 1/6. The idea is that you can still identify it as a 1/6, but then have the system physically change the morphology to fit a different tooth, right? So even in an instance where maybe you have a premolar that really should be a canine, but again, just based on the patient's anatomy, they don't have one, you could design it as a canine if you wanted, right? So in certain cases, it gives you that nice functionality of changing the morphology based on the space you have or based on the maybe more uniqueness of a patient's arch itself. In the positioning, I always want to make sure that when I'm doing a single unit crown, that adapted restoration calculation is turned on. That's essentially telling the system that the parameters are going to be applied to this for the crown itself. The only time I turn this off and I actually do anything with positioning is if it's a more complex case, maybe an implant supported bridge where I want to get more unique positioning when there's kind of no existing anatomy in the patient's mouth. That's when the positioning tool can be handy, and I would just at that point unselect adapted restoration calculation. But here I want basically my parameters of, especially contacts and occlusal strength basically to be considered. So that's why I keep the adapted restoration calculation turned on. Now in the edit element, again, if I went right from restoration parameters right into edit element, the system would give me a proposal, and then I could just go from there. I just wanted to show you adjust morphology and positioning, but those are considered optional when you're doing something like a single unit crown up to, a few unit bridges, that kind of thing. So when it comes to the proposal, software is going to give you a pretty nice proposal right from the start. However, there's of course tools that we can utilize to make any adjustments should we need to. So we do have the ability to turn on, obviously, the opposing, so we can look at, the anatomy, look at the contour, that sort of thing. And then we can, of course, turn that off of display objects. Now, the form tool allows us to add material, smooth material, or remove material from the crown. We have the move option, which allows us to move and rotate, but as well scale, right? So if we wanted to scale out, a buccal or lingual wall, we could. Then we have the shape tool, both anatomical and individual. So anatomical allows us to grab specific surface areas on the actual arch, just as we hover over with our cursor, whereas individual allows us to actually kind of individualize a certain area that we want to isolate. So we can change the size of the actual tool itself as well too. The recalculate option, if you hit recalculate and apply, it'll give you a new proposal. But I want to show you biogeneric variation. I was mentioning that in adjust morphology, with that turned on, we have the most functionality. So as I kind of change the intensity of the variation, I can see all the morphology changing, right? So again, the software did a really nice job of proposing something that fits in the patient's existing arch based on the anatomy that's around it. However, I can always change that. So then the reduce tool is the ability to do something like a cutback, right? So if you have a lab tech working with you and you want to layer porcelain, you can do so. Then the screw channel tool, if we wanted to add in a screw channel, obviously this is not actually a case that we need to add a screw channel, so I'm going to get an error here. But essentially here I can see here that I can change the angle of it, and I can determine the diameter of the actual screw channel hole itself. Okay, so that's kind of what you can do there. If you did need a precision attachment, we've got several precision attachments that you can add to the actual case itself. And then the final option is adjust contacts. So this is a nice way to just automatically adjust the contacts, for the actual case by hitting distal, occlusal, mesial. Now you'll notice that dynamic was grayed out. The reason being is that basically that we need to activate our virtual articulator, which I'll show you in just a moment. But here I'm just working on smoothing out my contacts at this point in time. So you'll see it was a little bit tighter there towards the gum line, probably a more subgingival prep, which it was on the distal there. So just fixing that up and smoothing and softening those edges. So then at this point in time, if I want to actually get the dynamic functionality basically viewed and see kind of an idea of how this patient's going to function with this crown, I can turn on the virtual articulator. So it's the icon on the far right hand side, the second from the last. And once you open up articulation parameters, you can basically change the parameters to fit your own specifications, or you can just use kind of the universal standard ones that you see here. Once you hit OK, it's going to virtually articulate this case. Okay, you always want to make sure that include restorations on the bottom is turned on so that it's using the crown that you've just designed. So at this point in time, you're able to exit the articulator here. So on the bottom left, you'll see the option to exit articulator. So at that point in time, you are able to then view things like the occlusal compass. Okay, so the occlusal compass will identify to us any areas of, whether it's protrusions, lateral protrusions, whatever the dynamic functionality is. But you'll see here under adjust contacts, the dynamic now comes up. So if I hit dynamic, it'll remove some for me. Might not remove all because it is also considering our parameters, so that I can go further with the smooth tool and just kind of smooth out any additional areas. Sometimes it will want you to kind of give that extra touch to it just to make sure that we're not removing too much material from a minimal thickness perspective. Now the manual move function is kind of neat. It allows us to kind of manipulate the patient's jaw as if it is on the articulator. So here we can actually kind of look down the actual pathway of the occlusion and dynamic strength and determine if there's any further adjustments. So once you are happy with the actual design, and you'll see that, the software gives really good proposals, so there's not a lot of finessing that has to happen. So at this point in time, we can move to the export stage. Now the export stage, if we export to inLab CAM, that's of course if you're using a Dentsply on a mill. So it's going to export directly to our CAM software to then get started with production. However, if you are exporting to STL and using a third-party software, that's fully a possibility as well too. So you just have to determine where you want to save it to. Now I'm going to actually open up my CAM software here because I want to take you through the new CAM software. So you'll see here all your attached equipment will be at the top of the screen. You just select which manufacturing machine you're going to utilize, and then you'll select the case there. Now you'll see on the bottom there's a fast forward option. So the fast forward option saves a lot of time in the inLab 22 so that there's not a lot of manipulation that has to happen. So it gets the case actually ready for you. And you'll see that you're right into the production stage. And at this point, you'd be able to basically place into the actual mill, the actual block itself, and then hit start. Now, the production simulation tool that I'm turning on here is basically determining how well the system's going to mill based on the detail level that we have selected. Right now it's high detail level at normal machining mode, so we're not going super fast or fast. We're basically going at a normal speed. Now if I change it to very high, you'll see that more anatomy detail will be ground in to the occlusal surface there. So that's kind of a nice option. Now if I want to go back and I want to basically maybe change the sprue position or anything like that, not a problem. I can always go into the arrange step and I can now, of course, continue to manipulate. So maybe I want to move that sprue, or maybe I want to rotate my crown so that I'm basically using it on the lingual aspect. That's definitely a possibility as well. But basically here you can see I'm able to move it should I need to. Or change the type of sprue as well too. So under restoration positioning, that's where I'm able to rotate basically 360 or 180, I guess, in this case. And I'm able to make sure that my sprue is on the lingual if I so please. So at this point in time, my case would be ready to go. So I can go back into the production stage and I can, again, determine my detail level that I want it to be milled at. Obviously, I recommend high or very high, right? Just to get the most anatomy details. Just going to pay a little bit more attention to those fine details. And then at this point in time, you're able to start production. Thank you so much.